Hi, YouTube.
Hey, everyone out there in YouTube land. Glad to have you. Just gonna give it a couple minutes here as we have people trickle in, connect to audio. All right, we're a couple minutes past, so let's get started. Looks like everyone's settled in. Welcome everyone to our Ask Me Anything office hours chat. This is our weekly discussion that takes place every Friday at 1:30 p.m. Eastern, where we have a different pragmatic instructor who gives answers to all things product. So my name is Callie Frisbee. I am the content and social strategist at Pragmatic, and I will be your host for today. Want to welcome product expert and pragmatic instructor Paul Young. Hey, Paul.
Hello, good to see everybody.
Good to see you. And Paul is enjoying not a cloud in the sky in Austin, Texas. Is that right, Paul?
That's right. It is gorgeous, gorgeous here. Spring has finally sprung. My red buds out in the garden are in full bloom. I love it. I love it. Love daylight savings time.
Great. Great. And so before, we get started, we want to give a shout out to the PAC, of course. This is the Pragmatic Alumni community. I'm so excited because I just heard that the PAC recently hit over 4,000 members. So super exciting. Yeah, the conversations are just becoming more and more enriching, and just a lot of talented folks in there that are really looking to, offer their resources and guidance. So it's been great to see. Again, our community is exclusive to everybody, no matter how you train with us, whether it be on demand or the virtual instructor-led courses, everyone gets a complimentary lifetime membership. So at Pragmatic, we're certainly committed to being your lifelong learning partner, not just being your trainers. So that's exciting. You can learn more about the community at pragmaticinstitute.com/community. Great. Well, why don't we go ahead and dig in? Just want to give a reminder to everybody on the call, everyone out there in YouTube land, that we did have some questions that were submitted prior to, but we always want to hear from folks on the call. So if you're out there in YouTube, feel free to hop in. Come late, leave early. This is certainly a time exclusively set for you to ask your product questions. And now we actually have a new promotion going on where the best live question gets lunch to their favorite restaurant on Pragmatic. So go ahead and bring those. We certainly want to hear from you. You can send them my way. You can put them in the chat, however you'd like to go about it. But Paul, we have a couple that have already been submitted. So how about I toss you over your first one?
Sounds good.
All right, Paul. So this first one comes from Dawn. And Dawn says, I'm new to product management, under a year, and got this position that she adores, by the way, from a previous supervisor that was running this current department. He recently got taken off of the product that she's on, and she's starting to feel overwhelmed and like she's thinking quickly. Any advice on how to pivot when you're already in the quicksand?
Good question. So Dawn, I feel your pain, and I think we've all been there. There's nothing, well, I'm sure there is, but it's pretty tough, when you're in a good situation, you've got a great manager, you've got somebody who you're working with that you respect and like, and then all of a sudden that person is gone. That air cover goes with them, right? Maybe they were shielding you a little bit from the rest of the organization and helping you, come into that new role. And especially the first couple of, months or year in that role you're kind of tender. It's a little tough. And so what do we do now? Now you're in a whole new world. That person's no longer there for whatever reason, and we got to figure things out. So I'll just give you a couple of ideas. There's probably no magic wand that we can wave to make everything better overnight, although that would be amazing. But just a few things that you can do yourself, and then maybe questions that you can ask of your organization or your new manager to make sure that you're positioning yourself for longer term success. So number one is your role clearly defined? If you went to Foundations, you said you did in your question, then you remember that we use the Pragmatic framework for help around definition of roles and responsibilities. So the question that I would put back to you is, do you have a clearly defined set of activities on the framework that you know that you own? If the answer to that is no, you need it. Because without that clear definition of roles on the framework that you own, then it gets pretty hard to say no to anything. because now you're just sort of doing everything. And so if you remember from foundations, we teach a concept we call gap analysis to look at the framework and figure out where your gaps are, but also what you're going to own. That would be a really good activity for you to go through as an individual, but also for you to go through with your team to figure out, does everyone understand what they own and what they don't? Once you get to that common understanding of your role, I would encourage you to sit down with your new manager, your new executive, whoever you're reporting to now. Presumably, your old manager who you really liked, your mentor left. Hopefully you report to somebody now, maybe a different executive. Sit down with them. And if you have that understanding of your role based on the gap analysis that you did, you can then sit in that meeting and say, this is what we defined as my role and all the things you want me to own. Here's all the stuff that I'm actually doing that maybe doesn't match up with that understanding of the role. And what do you want me to do from here? If you're taking on other things, if you're getting buried in what you call the quicksand, or what I sometimes call the firefighting, then maybe that means we need to look at opportunities to get you out of some of that stuff. Maybe that means bringing in resources from other parts of the organization. Maybe that means, thinking about as an executive, how I can give you air cover, to make that happen. Or maybe that just means we have a conversation about how to say no. Saying no is it's always a little scary, especially if you're in a new role or if you're in an individual contributor type role. But I will tell you as an executive, one of the things that I really valued the most in my people was the ability to say no. And so I think learning how to say no is a skill that can be learned and it can be taught. And so I'll give you the little pep talk that I would give to my product managers about saying no here for just 30 seconds. And if you want to talk more, I'm happy to connect with you offline. I'll put my email address here in the chat so that everybody can access it. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions. But here's the way it goes. You need to say no, right? So let's say somebody comes to you to do a roadmap presentation or to help sales answer an RFP or to do something that we've defined as not part of your role. And you look at that request, the quicksand, the firefighting, so to speak, and you think to yourself, okay, this person is making a lot of noise. Maybe they're even senior to you in the organization. It's pretty hard to just go to them with a hard no. You can say no without saying no. So here's how you do it. You go to them and say, you know what? I am more than happy to help you with that request. But here's the problem. My executive has asked me to focus on this other set of items. So I can get to your request in about 3 weeks' time. And so as long as you're cool with that, I'm happy to help you. I can book you out of my schedule for that. And what you're going to find then is one of two things will happen. Either they will escalate to your executive, and then it's no longer your problem. It becomes an executive to executive level discussion. And if they want to redirect your time, they have that prerogative anyways. But either way, it's not your issue to deal with. Or that fire will go away and it will go to somebody else who doesn't have that restriction on their time or role. Because fires, it's kind of like water rolling downhill. It tends to find the easiest path to the bottom. And so they'll do that. They'll just find another source. And so saying no doesn't have to be scary. It doesn't have to come with a hard no, I'm not going to help you. It can be yes, but it's going to take me 3 weeks to get to that. So that's another way to say no. It's just something to think about as you evolve through the next year. Hope that helps.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I also think it's like when you're saying no, you're also offering solutions, right? Like I can, or this person might be better suited or whatever. I think that certainly people I identify to that. But I love that you talk about gap analysis because we've been talking to a bunch of our PAC members, like what was their aha moment? And a lot of them talk about gap analysis. It's one of my personal favorites where it's like you can just literally see those discrepancies like on paper. And it really helps you start implementing like day one on how you can pivot. That's great. And welcome to Perry. Hey, Perry, happy to have you. Feel free to pop any questions that you have in the chat. Best live question does win lunch on us. So excited to have you. Feel free to shoot those to me separately or in the chat as a whole. In the meantime, Paul, I have your next question here. This comes from Nicholas, who says, can you share some good resources for developing a go-to-market strategy for a B2C product?
Great question. So this is one of those where the answer to this question, like so much of what you would get into in marketing and product management, is it depends. And so like just saying B2C, pretty broad. Like B2C covers everything from the stuff you buy at the grocery store through buying a major new purchase, like a new car or a Peloton or something like that. And so the go-to-market for something like a Peloton would look very different than the go-to-market for something that is, sold through a channel or a retail store or, a website. And so I think I would need to know a little bit more in order to really provide a solid answer to this question, but I'll just give you some broad guidance as to what you could take as a step from here. So a good go-to-market strategy, regardless of what type of product we're selling, regardless of B2C or B2B, is formed based on an understanding of our buyer persona. And so in order to form that understanding of the buyer, that means we have to do a little bit of market research, and we have to form the buyer persona, and we have to get to what's called the buyer's experience. Some people refer to that as the buyer's journey. Basically, this is all the steps that a buyer takes when they're making a decision to buy a product like yours. And so, for example, a lot of people think that, the first decision, the start of the buyer's cycle is when they contact our sales team or they come to our website. But that's actually like the 7th or 8th step typically that a buyer takes. If you think about buying a new whatever, a major purchase, the first thing you're going to do, like if you're buying a new car, the first thing you do is not go to the dealer and say, I want to take a test drive. That's like the 8th thing you do. The first thing you do is you get on Google and you do some research. And then you go to consumer reports, you look at some reviews, you might do some, shopping on Kelley Blue Book to see what cars are worth. You might call a friend to say, hey, what do you use? Are you happy with it? And so on. And after going through like 5 or 6 steps, then you finally go to Ford.com and you look at, their different models and the pricing, and maybe you do some building on there. And then finally, after that, maybe you call the dealer and ask for a test drive. And so that whole thing is the buyer's journey that informs the go-to-market strategy. And so we can't come up with a good go-to-market until we know what is the buyer's journey they're trying to go through. And so I would encourage you when developing go-to-market to look at the buyer's journey as the first step. And then if you want some additional resources, Callie mentioned the PAC, the Pragmatic Alumni community. We've got now over 4,000 members. That's great. I didn't know that. But that's a really great place. I guarantee you that on the PAC right now are people in B2C who are going through the same challenges that you're going through. And so I would throw your question out there as well and see, maybe talk to some people who are in the same boat as you are, see what they have to say.
Great. Hi, Lanka. Welcome. Good to have you. Thanks for joining.
Thanks. I couldn't find the link for a while. Sorry.
Welcome, Perry.
Happy you're here. Great. And in the meantime, feel free to toss those questions into the chat, but I do have another one for you, Paul. This one comes from Melissa, who asks, what cognitive biases do you think are most important to minimize, and how as product people should we best go about it? Wow, that's a loaded one.
I love this question. So this question is so good because most people don't even think about their own cognitive biases. That's why they're called biases, right? We don't realize we have them in many cases. And so there's certainly a lot of biases that we have. Like maybe you personally prefer Mac over PC, or maybe you personally like, using mobile apps on your phone or whatever. And so the question is, does that match your buyer or user? I don't know until we do the research. And so I would say probably the biggest cognitive bias that I've seen in product managers and product teams comes from product managers who came out of industry, which is a little bit weird to think about because if you go look at most hiring posts for product managers, they will say things like, I want a product manager with 15 years of experience in the healthcare space, or 15 years of experience in financial tech or whatever. And it's almost like we really value industry experience. And I get it. I understand why, but it creates this problem because now I hire a product manager to work on my healthcare focused product, for example, and they've got 15 years of experience in the healthcare market. Well, guess what? They start to lean on that old industry experience like a crutch. And they start to make assumptions about the market based on things that used to be true in their experience 5, 10, 15 years ago. And you'll know this is happening when you hear people inside of your company say things like, well, you know what, Sarah, 10 years ago, when I worked in the industry, this is how we did things. That was 10 years ago. Is that still true today? I don't know, maybe, but we need to go out and check it. I'm sure many of you have heard this old saying, trust but verify, right? I might trust that your market knowledge is good, but guess what? We need to verify it. So how do we check our cognitive biases? Easy. We go out and do our market research, and you ask your open-ended questions, high gain questions, and you do your validation with a large statistically significant sample size to see if what the market has to say matches what's up in your head from when you used to work in the industry, or what your biases are. They may not be, or they may not match. And if they don't match, guess what? That's awesome, because now you just learned something new. So don't take the fact that things have changed and they don't match your old expectations as a bad thing. It's actually a really good thing, because now you've just overcome one of those biases. And so I always, whenever I was hiring a product manager, I wouldn't actually look for industry experience. I kind of cut against the grain a little bit. My rule of thumb was that when I was hiring a product manager, I could teach them one of two things. I could either teach them how to be a good product manager by sending them to Pragmatic training or whatever, or I could teach them about my industry. If I had to teach them both, that's kind of hard. But I would either take somebody who knew a lot about the industry and teach them product management skills, or I would take a really good product manager and teach them about my industry. Usually the latter more than the former. But I find that oftentimes many organizations overemphasize or overvalue industry experience and technical skills over the ability to learn, which I would say curiosity is the number one thing that I would hire for in product managers. I want somebody who, they're not just going to be content sitting behind their desk working on things they used to know 5 years ago. I want somebody who's adept at getting out from behind their desk and into the market and having those conversations. So that's what I would look for during hiring. And yeah, I would hope that if you're aspiring to be a great product manager, you wouldn't be content, leaning on that old bias.
Yeah. And Paul, when it comes to like the cognitive biases, I mean, you said you have to do the research, right? I mean, do you think it's more like qualitative or quantitative? Do you think it's a mix of both? I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
It's both. And the scary thing about bias is that it will show up in your questions if you're not careful. So like, for example, if I'm really biased about like a certain solution, I might ask a question during my market research, and I might say, Callie, wouldn't you agree that this mobile app that I'm showing you is the best thing ever? I mean, that's a pretty biased question, right? I baked the answer I wanted into the question. So that's an example of the bias coming through in the interview. And we obviously don't want to do that. And so one of the things that we teach teams on how to do is ask what we call open-ended high gain questions. So these are questions that can't be answered with a yes, no. It's a lot harder to bias an open-ended question. So if I say, Callie, tell me a little bit about your workflow during the day, or give me an example of what are the first couple of things you do when you sit down at your desk in the morning or whatever. Pretty hard to bias a question like that. And so you're going to get a little bit less bias in those open-ended questions. For surveys or for quantitative research, there's a whole industry that has cropped up to remove bias in survey questions. It's called data science. And so this is one of those areas where I would refer you to a data scientist, or maybe check out our class called The Business of Data Science, which is really about how do we use big data and how do we make sure we get good representative samples in the market to feed our decision-making process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. So here's one that we have on the call today. Here's one that was in a chat today that Beth's not sure to answer. How I should use financial value to determine price. If I put more performance items in the list than others, then result is not fair as performance is overweighted. Do I need to control a balance between categories? If that doesn't make sense, don't ask it. LOL is what Beth says. But Beth, feel free to come off mute, and if you want to clarify anything, we can kind of go from there.
Yeah, this was a young lady who was on chat this morning, and she was really working towards somebody telling her about the financial value to determine price. And so she went through a whole list of items, and she's just very confused on that.
Okay, I think I understood the question. So I'm going to answer the question I think I heard. And then if it's wrong, then I'm more than happy to connect with this person later, and maybe they can give me a little bit more detail. So when we think about how to price the prompt, the way we want to price the product is a method of pricing that we call value-based pricing. And what that means is that we're pricing the product based on what people are willing to pay for the product. Now that's, as it turns out, really easy for me to sit up here as an instructor and say, you should price it based on what people are willing to pay, but it's actually really hard to figure it out. And the reason is hard to figure out is that you can't just go and ask someone directly what they're willing to pay. I mean, you can, but you just get really bad data. And the example I always use when I'm thinking about this topic is this little thing. I keep this on my desk to show people whenever we're talking about this. I'll hold it up so you can see it. So it kind of looks like a little like scuba device that you put in your mouth, but this is actually called an AeroFit. And this is a little product that I picked up, about a year ago. I bought it from a company in Europe, and this is actually a breathing trainer. And so you stick it in your mouth, and there's a little Bluetooth device here that will connect to your phone with an app. And it's got a valve on either side of this thing, one that controls the air pressure required to breathe in, and another that controls the air pressure required to breathe out. And so this is actually called a breathing trainer. So it actually trains your lungs by running through your lungs through a series of exercises to become stronger. And I use it for weight training and athletic performance. Other people use it because they're worried about COVID or whatever, but it's a pretty neat little tool. Now, the question I always ask people is that if you were the product manager for this and you went out into the market and asked people directly, like if I went to Beth and said, Beth, here's my little product and I explain it to you, how much are you willing to pay for this? If I ask people straight on, what kind of answers do you think I'm going to get if I ask people straight on what they're willing to pay? Any ideas?
As little as possible.
There you go. You're going to get lowball answers. Exactly. So we've been trained as a society to lie when asked what we're willing to pay for something, because I know you're doing pricing research and I'm going to lowball you, trying to get you to price it lower than what you might want. And so the big idea here is that when you're trying to figure out how much you can charge for something and what people are willing to pay, you can't go through what I refer to as the front door when asking that question. You have to go through the side door or the back door. And as it turns out, there's a bunch of different ways to do that research. But specific to the question that was asked here, if you're asking how much can I charge for a specific feature, that's one of the hardest things to do in pricing research, because most product managers at some point in their career are going to get asked, how much revenue would I lose if I cut this one feature? Or how much revenue would I gain if I add this one feature? It's so hard to answer that question because most people don't associate revenue to individual features. They think about the overall package. But there is one type of market research that can help you answer this question. So if you're ever asked to associate revenue to an individual feature, the little thing the seed that I want you to plant in your head that you're going to come back to is called conjoint analysis, conjoint. So you're going to have to run what's called a conjoint study. Conjoint studies can help you associate revenue to individual features. However, here's the catch. They're kind of expensive. It might actually be more expensive to run the conjoint study than just to build the feature in the first place. And so you're going to have to ultimately decide if it makes sense to run the conjoint study. But if you really want to get specific and precise about tying revenue to individual features, that would be the research you would look at. Hope that helps.
I'll send it on.
Great. And I'm sorry, but Beth's in the lead, whether it's her question or a question through somebody. So Lanka and Perry, feel free to pop those into the chat. We do have Paul for another 20 minutes. So we will certainly take that time to continue to pick your brain, Mr. Young. I have your next question here. This one comes from Mohammed. And he asks, are there any resources or key pointers I can take to my higher up surrounding the build by partner conversation? As much as I respect them, I feel like they're lacking clarity on all fronts.
Okay, buy build partner. Love this question. Buy build partner is a really, I would say, understudied and misunderstood process in most organizations. Oftentimes people get really sort of wrapped up in the axle here with buy build partner decisions. We have some guidance about when you should buy, when you should build, and when you should partner. And the basic way I would think about it is this. I want you to buy the basics. So the basics would include anything where there is a vibrant market of companies who are trying to sell it to you. So I'll give you some examples. In software, basics would include report writers, databases, single sign-on technology, and so on. If you're building a piece of software or SaaS, it probably doesn't make any sense to roll your own database. Like, that's reinventing a wheel. That problem has already been solved a lot. So why would I want my precious engineering resources reinventing a wheel that already exists? Just license that somewhere else. So that's buy in software. In hardware, examples of basics that you would want to buy or license or acquire would be things like processors, motherboards, chassis, storage like hard drives, and so on. There's probably no reason for you to roll your own hard drive. If you're building an IoT device, like, why would you do that? Instead, focus on something that is going to make you uniquely great, not reinventing a wheel. So that's the stuff you buy, license, acquire on the buy side. For build, the only things that we recommend you build are those things that reinforce your DNA. So we have this concept at Pragmatic Institute that we call your distinctive competencies. And the way you think about them, a distinctive competency is a core competency that nobody else has. It's a distinctive competency. It's distinct to you. And so I think of it as your organizational DNA. It's the stuff that makes you special, the stuff that makes you great. These are the things that we want to go build. Because if something is truly a distinctive competency, then guess what? Nobody else can build it. Only you can. And so that's what I want my precious engineering resources extending, is the stuff that makes us uniquely great. So that's buy, that's build. Partner is basically everything else. So partner could be around technology, but it could also be around sales or marketing. There's reasons beyond just technology that you might partner. And specifically for partnerships, there is, most companies, that's where they get screwed up. Buy and build are usually pretty okay, but partnerships are where they get screwed up. And so there's some additional resources I might point you to on partnerships. One of them is this author named Lorraine Siegel, and I happen to have her book here on my desk because I was looking at it earlier. She wrote this book. I'll hold it up to the screen so you can see it. It's called Intelligent Business Alliances. And her name has kind of a weird spelling, so I'll hold it up here so you can see it. It's Lorraine Siegel, Larraine. So if you search her out and you search her book, Intelligent Business Alliances, on Google, then I'm sure you'll find it. As it turns out, she was a lawyer in South Africa, and she immigrated to the US and she started to work on partnerships between tech companies. And she found some really common modes of failure between partnerships of tech companies. And there's some good lessons to be learned here to help you think about how you make a partnership successful, and most importantly, how you align expectations so that things don't blow up down the road. So I would encourage you, if you want to go deeper, check that out. Callie just put the link to that book in the chat for Amazon.
Great. I'm actually really excited about this next one, Paul. I'm interested to hear your answers because, obviously we have our new design vertical. So this one kind of surrounds design. This comes from Donovan, who asks, what are some ways to empower our engineers to better contribute to our design solutions? I feel like we're often spoon feeding them. How can I effectively still give them the why and the what, but empower them to execute the how more independently without causing unnecessary friction?
Great question. So how do we give them the why and the what and empower them to do the how? The question is framed correctly. What we don't want to do is give them the how. We want to focus on the who, the what, the why, and the when, and then involve other people for a conversation around the how. And so if any of you have ever come to our class called Build, we share with you this fun little case study about this product here. So if you're not familiar with this is the Fisher Space Pen. Pretty cool little product. The ink in the Space Pen is this sort of, they call it thixotropic ink that, is pressurized and, allows it to write in zero gravity and so on. Now, Space Pen is pretty cool, but if I go to my engineering team and say, build me a Space Pen, then they're going to build a Space Pen, right? On the other hand, if I say, go help us solve the problem of making notes in space, all of a sudden that opens their creative mind to come up with something that might be even better. And so what we think of is a more collaborative approach. And so the way I'm going to describe it here is, imagine that you, as the product manager, your engineer or architect, and your designer are together. You're three passengers in a car and you're going on a road trip. During the first phase of the road trip, the product manager is going to be in the driver's seat, and your designer and your architect are going to be navigating. So you think about like Sarah going around on her road trip in her RV right now. She's the driver, and she's got a navigator, right? And so right now we're in the what, the who, the why, and the when phase. Your designer, your architect, they're still involved, but product manager, they're holding the wheel, they're driving. Now, at some point on that road trip, it's going to become time for product management to jump out of the driver's seat and someone else to drive. And typically in the next phase, it's going to be your designer. And when I say design, we're talking about both front end and back end design. And we start envisioning solutions, how might we solve their problems, and so on. And so product manager is still in the car, you're still on the road trip, except now you're not driving, you're more of a navigator. You're involved in the conversations, but you don't have your hands on the wheel. And then eventually, once we start to build the solution, guess what? The designer and architect, they hop out of the driver's seat and the engineer hops in. And everyone else is still involved. We're still navigating. We're still helping them with the conversation, but it's the engineer who puts their hands on the wheel. And so I think when we envision that as a more collaborative approach, we can get to a better place. And so this is something that we actually explore quite a bit in our classes called Build and Design. And for those of you that might not be familiar, Pragmatic, we just introduced our first new class in quite some time called Design, that is specifically about exploring this interaction between the product team and the design team and the engineering team, and how do they work together to envision better solutions that will delight our users. I have the book for it right here. So we just started offering this, so go check out Design. That would be my first starting point. We have a lot of resources on our website that we published, ebooks and so on, that are free. That you can go look at as well, that will help you with this design conversation. And also finally go to the pack. There are designers on the pack. Our design team is on there too. You can have some good conversations there to help you make this more productive.
That's great. Yeah, and I just want to give a little shout out to Steve Goodyear. He was our first PMC 8 graduate. So super excited to have him, and we'll actually be having him on an upcoming podcast soon. So make
That's
sure
amazing. That's amazing. So he went through foundations, focus, build, design, market, launch, price, and the business of data science. Wow.
Yep.
That's
yeah,
amazing.
we're excited to have him. I think that it's going to be a rich conversation.
Way to go, Steve.
Great. Paul, I got another one here for you. This comes from Kyle, who says, we're a startup who's been making great strides through the pandemic to continue to grow slowly yet strongly. My question is, in my recent conversations with fellow PMs and PMMs, the word startup seems to kind of come across as a toxic term almost. Not sure if it's fear-based or economic, but I want to be able to convey our worth as a startup without having to defend it each and every time.
Sure. So I love this question because there's all these baked in assumptions here that I think you're hearing out there in the market. Like some people look at the word startup and they're like, ooh, that feels risky. Do I want to do business with a startup that might not be here tomorrow? I think that's probably what's underlying a lot of this. Startup does not have to be a bad word. Every company that's successful today was a startup at some point. And so, yeah, I don't think we need to look at startup as a bad thing. In fact, quite the opposite. It's a really, really good thing. Because startups are like the creative fire that consumes, older, less innovative companies. And so that's a really natural thing that happens all the time. And so, how do we disarm some of that conversation and make it feel less risky to a buyer? I mean, one is pointing to your growth rate and the, ability to solve problems and so on. But what I would really start off here, if I was having that conversation, would be to focus in on the problems you're solving. Because a startup exists for a reason, right? And that reason is to solve a problem for your market that maybe some of the larger players haven't really addressed, or maybe they don't address it as well as you do. And so if you can sit down with a potential buyer and say, yeah, you know what, we are a startup. We've been around for, a year or 2 years or 3 years or whatever, but we're solving this specific problem. We are laser focused on that problem. And we're solving it in a way that some of the other players are not. And we've seen a ton of resonance and traction in solving that problem in the market. And that's why we're here to talk to you today. What you're going to find is that, every buyer is different, right? Some buyers will say, I only do business with companies that have 100 million in revenue and have been around for 20 years. But a lot of organizations, what they really want is to solve their problem. And they don't really care if you've only been around for 3 years, or you only have 10 million in funding, or you only have 50 employees or whatever. If you can solve their problem, if you can demonstrate that you can execute, then that's really what matters. So I would always focus it back in on the problem.
Yeah. And I got one from Lanka here coming in hot. Lanka asks, what should we start with first if we're going to establish the pragmatic way of product management in a company? Besides sending our product managers to pragmatic training, I am not a product manager, but heading to software engineering and working closely with product managers. I'm putting together some personas to help out with the pragmatic classes that I've taken, and I'm getting incremental ideas instead of innovative ideas from the product.
Good question, Lanka. So let's talk about that. I will tell you that over the past 10 years or so as an instructor, and then prior to that as a product management executive, I've worked with somewhere between 300 and 400 teams across lots of different companies to implement as you said, the pragmatic way of thinking, or the pragmatic way of product management. And obviously across those 300 or 400, there's been varying degrees of success. Some do it really well and some are, more middling. So I can tell you that amongst the teams that successfully implement the pragmatic way of thinking within an organization, there are a couple of, factors that I see in common that really make this thing drive forward versus those that don't. So one, I'll just give you a list of things you might think about. One thing that the ones that are successful do that the ones that aren't successful don't is they start off after training, of course, by doing the gap analysis. And so, if you went to pragmatic session or your product managers did, they're very familiar with this concept and tool. And I'll pull it up here for a moment so that we can look at it together and just show you a very brief picture of what this looks like. So hopefully I can share my screen here. Oh, look at that. Can you all see my kids? Aren't they cute? They are cute. That's not why we came. So let me pull this over here. So this is our gap analysis worksheet. This is something that everyone gets access to when they come through the foundations session. But basically the way this works is that every activity on the pragmatic framework is represented here. And you can start to think about who is the current owner of that activity, in this case, product management. Is that the right owner going forward, proposed owner? Maybe I want to change that. Maybe I want to give that one over to product marketing manager. Then I want to ask, how important is that activity on a scale from 0 to 5, 5 being the highest? And then what is our self-assessment of how we're doing? Also on a scale from 0 to 5, 5 being the highest. When you fill this all the way out, all the way down for all 37 activities as a team, it's going to give you a couple things. One, it's going to paint a picture of who owns what that is very clear and we can all be on the same page for. But the other great thing it gives you is this, a nice color-coded framework that looks like this one that I'm showing you here. This is just an example, but on this one, I can show my red, green, yellow, kind of like a stoplight approach. The red boxes are the ones that I have big gaps. Yellow is in the middle and green, I'm doing pretty well. And so this gives the team a short-term roadmap for where they might want to improve in the future and how they might want to think about what they do next. And so teams that do pragmatic well, they tend to do the gap analysis, not just once, but they do it every quarter or so to see how their gaps are shifting and changing over time. Gives you a good short-term roadmap as a team. So that's one thing to do, gap analysis. The other thing that they do is they hire, or not hire, they assign a named role to own pragmatic implementation within the organization. Maybe that's you, maybe that's the leader of product management, maybe that's somebody in a project management role, but this is the person who I would point to say, who's going to get us back together on a regular basis and start talking about using the tools and templates, about making sure we have market data to drive innovation, as your question posed, that we're not just looking at incremental stuff, but we're trying to figure out what's the next big problem we're trying to solve. Without a named person driving the team to adopt some of these things, what ends up happening in my experience is that the education and training provided, it sort of diffuses into the group and the group says, oh yeah, that's good learning. We should totally use all that someday. But then guess what? Someday never happens. And so we need someone driving this stuff to actually happen. So I like to find a named person whose responsibility it is to drive that. And then the last thing I would share to really implement this stuff well is it works really good when we train the team from the bottom up, right? We train engineering, we train product management and so on, but it works best when it's also being pushed from the top down. And so that means there has to be a level of executive buy-in as well. Product management transitioning from being sales driven, engineering driven, founder driven to what we call market driven from the outside in. It requires a different way of working from the product team's perspective. That means that some of the work they did in the past, they may not do into the future. And in order to get there, that doesn't happen by magic. It requires executive attention and air cover. And so having the executive team bought in and moving in the same direction with the same expectations of product, I think is pretty critical. Pragmatic provides some tools to help that happen. Some tools for the executive team to read about what is product management. We also do an executive session that's like a short couple of hours with the executive team to get them bought in. But that top-down push to go with everything else that we're doing in the organization is fairly critical in my experience to make this happen well. Lanka, I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Lanka. And we've hit our time. And Paul, I don't know, have you picked the question of the day yet?
I have. Lanka's question was amazing. So
Okay.
She is our winner.
That's a good one. Yeah, no, I agree. I think, certainly just very robust and, everyone always has those questions of really how can we implement that training, especially when they have such, specific scenarios and, the roles are always so different, right? So I agree. Congrats to Lanka on question of the day. It does look like we've hit our time. So if anybody wants to pop in any last questions, feel free to do so. Other than that, Paul, thanks so much for hanging out with us. We always appreciate you and your time. Oh, here we go. Lanka has another one. She loves the starting point. I can find the gap analysis template in the pack. Yes, you certainly can. All of that. And we have recently started grouping resources by the framework as well. So if you need a brush up on anything, you can certainly find that there. Yeah, in the meantime, thank you so much for joining. Paul just put his Pragmatic Institute email address in the chat. He's always so great about spending time and taking those questions. So feel free to utilize him. For those out in YouTube land, it is pyoung@pragmaticinstitute.com. And other than that, I just want to give a little plug here to our next product chat. This takes place next Tuesday, March 23rd at 1:30 p.m. Eastern. We're going to be welcoming Jean-Sebastian Tassi. He is the Director of Products and Innovation at XRM Vision, and he'll be doing a discussion on the secrets behind a B2B marketing campaign that delivered a 20+ ROI. So exciting stuff. We're going to learn how to, tweak messaging to our B2B audiences, kind of top marketing activities that deliver, and really some best ways to measure campaign success. So make sure that you join us for that. You can find that sign up on our events page or on any of our social media outlets. In the meantime, thank you to everyone who joined. Paul, thank you again for offering your expertise, and everyone have a great weekend.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Kelly. We'll see you soon.